Adams State College. Great stories begin here.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming tonight to the final ASC faculty lecture of the spring semester of 2011. This evening, it's my pleasure to introduce my friend Dr. George Backen, Professor of Philosophy, Associate Professor of Philosophy here at Adams State College. He and I actually started at the same time, got tenured at the same time, so we had some philosophical ties or something like that. I'd like to point out that Dr. Backen has both a PhD and a Juris Doctorate from the State University of New York at Buffalo. So if you have legal questions you'd like to ask about animal rights and how to cook them, feel free to ask. He can handle both kinds. But at this time, I'm going to let him do all the good talking. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Dr. George Backen.
Unfortunately, if you want me to go ahead and answer any legal questions, I will have to charge you. The philosophy, though, is free. But today I'm going to go ahead and give a talk on the meaningful lives of animals. Before I give that talk, though, let me just mention that this talk is dedicated to Bert the turkey. Bert was a very good turkey, and we shared a lot of meaningful moments together. With the loss of Bert, I realized that this is an extremely unfair world when turkeys like Bert die and turkeys like Trudy continue on. Trudy is a horrible turkey. But how the talk is going to go, a lot of people might not be familiar with how we go ahead and do moral philosophy. So I'm going to give a brief overview of how we conduct moral investigations. After I give that brief overview, I'll give a common criticism of morality, which is that it's relative. And so there really isn't any reason to make any sort of moral judgments, because morality is dependent upon the society that you live, or it is dependent upon the individual. And then we'll go ahead and argue why that there's good reasons not to accept that, despite what anthropologists might tell you. From there, what I'm going to do is take a look at some ethical theories, and the ethical theories, how they apply to animals, and then we'll look at specific applications of consequentialism, utilitarianism, with Peter Singer. I'll say what's wrong with Peter Singer. We'll go ahead and take a look at a deontological argument from Tom Regan. I'll say what's wrong with Tom Regan, and then I'll provide my own. At the end, what I'll do is I'll give some criticisms of my view, and then I'll leave time for you people to go ahead and tell me what's wrong with what I said. This is how philosophy progresses, which is you go ahead and tell me why it's absolutely not correct, you know. So anyway, to go ahead and begin, the way that we go ahead and do moral investigations or ethics is that we want to go ahead and define what moral goodness is. Once we know what moral goodness is, then we can determine right and wrong action. Right action is going to be that which promotes, advances, or realizes the good. Wrong action is going to be what that diminishes, inhibits, or destroys the good. So the first thing that you want to do in ethics, it's called metaethics, which is define the good. And then you do the ethical theory, which is that you can go ahead and figure out right and wrong action, and then you apply it to specific situations or specific issues. This is how ethics is done. And that's what we're going to be doing today. The way we go ahead and judge among theories is that we evaluate the arguments of the theories. So today what I'm going to be doing is giving a lot of arguments and a lot of criticisms to the arguments. And the way that you criticize arguments is that you evaluate them. And you can evaluate arguments in different ways. The first way is going to be whether or not it has false premises. So that if I give you an argument and it has a false premise, there is no reason to accept that conclusion. The other thing that might be wrong with my arguments is that the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. So there's something wrong with the logical structure of it. This is something else that you could go ahead and criticize me about, or other people, or other theories. And then other fallacies. This really isn't that important. A fallacy is it's a defect in an argument not attributable to false premises. But we'll run into those. So the basic idea of what we do in moral investigation when we go ahead and look at all these arguments is that that which cannot be rationally justified ought not to be accepted. So that if you cannot rationally justify your position, there is no reason to accept it. How do we determine whether or not it's rationally justified? We evaluate the arguments. You go ahead and provide a conclusion. We ask, why do you hold that view? And then we evaluate whether there's a good reason to hold that view. If there isn't, we cast it to the fire. Or we redevelop it. We go ahead and fix it. And so the idea behind this is that the progress in moral theory is that we move away from error. This is true in all philosophy. So for example, I'm teaching a philosophy of mind class right now, and in that philosophy of mind, the history of philosophy of mind is basically littered with the debris of destroyed theories or no good theories. Some of these are philosophical theories, like Cartesian dualism and idealism, and some of them are more scientific theories, like behaviorism, functionalism, and identity theory, that these don't work because their arguments don't work, and so they're cast aside. So that there is progress that can be done in moral theory, and this is exactly how we're going to do it. I'm going to give you a bunch of arguments today. An example of a moral theory might be good equals obedience to the will of God. Now, if this is good, if this can be supported as good, then we know what right action is. Right action is obeying the commands of God. Wrong action is violating the commands of God, and then there will also be morally neutral actions, those on which God has remained silent, and so that we can go ahead and do whatever we want in that field. Unless, of course, you can apply from what God has said is right and wrong to that. So this is an example of a moral theory. From this, we would go ahead and evaluate the moral theory. So for example, if you want to go ahead and hold the divine command theory, which is that moral goodness is determined by the will of God, we might ask such things, well, is there a God? This is a metaphysical question. Is there a God out there, right? And then, of course, what you have to do is provide some sort of justification. Faith ain't going to help you here. How do we know the will of God? This is an epistemological question. How do we come to have knowledge of these things? And then there's also other problems that you might consider. For example, is there substantive content to the claim that goodness, moral goodness, depends upon the will of God? And this is a logical question. This is one of the areas where the divine command theory has problems. The problem is that there's no extra divine standard by which to judge the goodness of God's commands. What I mean by this is that when you want to apply the notion of good, there has to be some standard by which we can apply this notion. And that if you just say that God's will is good, basically all you're saying is God's will is God's will. And the reason why is there's no way to evaluate whether or not God's will is good or not. If you just want to say that's just what it is, the problem is it's completely tautologous and it's empty of content whatsoever. Because whatever God wills, that happens to be good. Perhaps you like what God wills now, but tomorrow God could go ahead and will that rape or genocide are morally permissible. Consequently, rape and genocide would be morally permissible. So that there isn't any standard by which to judge these things, and so this might be a problem with divine command theory. So this is what we would do in ethics. Now, in ethics, there's two theories that are dominant. Wait, let me do this. There is a criticism of morality, which you will get from people like the anthropologist. And the criticism to this is going to be the problem of diversity of moral views. And we'll go ahead and take a look at this criticism up close. Is the speakers on?
Should be good.
Well, I was making a number of kind of crass generalisations about the Scots, about my country. I don't believe any of them. Again, I did it for comic effect. But you do meet people who have very fixed notions about other groups of people. I'll give you an example of what I mean. I got in a cab in London in December, and about 5 minutes into the journey, apropos of nothing, early on a Sunday morning, the cab driver turned round to me and he said, "I think all homosexuals should be killed." Now, whatever you think of that, Glasgow, as a statement, you have to admit it's a bold opening conversation. With a stranger. And I was a bit taken aback. I went to him, "Oh, why do you think that?" And then there was a pause, because he'd obviously never had to go to the next level of the argument. Fraternising mainly with cab drivers, so that was just accepted. So, and he said, well, after a moment, he said, well, because homosexuality is immoral. And I said, this is honestly true, I said, I'm not sure how much weight you can afford to place on the notion of morality in this argument, because morality is not a fixed thing, it changes its parameters culturally, historically, over time. I said, for example, Look at ancient Greece. To this day, we still take most of our most fundamental principles about ethics, aesthetics, philosophy, medicine, science, whatever, from ancient Greece. And yet, I said, in ancient Greece, love between two men, far from being immoral, was actually considered the highest, most ethical, most profound, if you will, most moral form of love that there could be. So all I'm saying, I said to him, is I'm not sure how useful morality is, given its flexible nature, as a cornerstone of your argument on this subject. And then he said to me, this is honestly true, he said, well, you can prove anything with facts, can't you? For a minute I went, yeah, and I thought, hang on, that's the most fantastic way of winning an argument I've ever heard. I'm not interested in facts. I find they tend to cloud my judgment. I prefer to rely on instinct and blind prejudice.
Okay. So a criticism to moral investigation might be that there is a diversity of moral views, so that morality has changed within our society over time, that it certainly is different when you across cultures, and so perhaps that there isn't anything to morality at all. And the reason why you would think that, the diversity of views within societies and across societies. That's not such a great argument. The failure of the argument from diversity, so if you want to criticize moral theory based on this, is that diverse views do not evidence a lack of absolute truth. That there was a time when people would go ahead and have diverse views about the shape of the earth. There are currently diverse views about the fate of the universe. And of course, the existence of God. There are many diverse views. But that doesn't mean that there isn't any truth to it. It's true that there are many views on the idea of God, but given that they're all in contradiction, it has to follow that either one is right or they're all wrong. But it's still the case that the Christian God may be the case, and that the other ones are wrong. But of course, in philosophy, you would have to have good arguments in order to support the case for the Christian God. So just because there are diverse views doesn't mean that there's any truth of the matter. So granting that there is diversity in moral ideas, now and across time, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's no absolute truth. In a reply to Lee's argument that homosexuality accepted in Greek society, one of the things is that you can also criticize this view. And you would criticize this view by considering this, that it's true that homosexuality may have been accepted in Greek society by way of the public. But Plato, who is maybe the greatest philosopher of the Greeks, he did not accept, or he thought that homosexuality was morally wrong. Now the thing is, we might consider Plato to be the expert, and we might consider the common person to be ignorant of it. Plato might be the expert because he spends more time considering this, he works these ideas out, and so the thing is, his judgment might be better than the judgment of other people, especially the common person who doesn't go the one step further in considering the justifications for their views. And so, just as if you're sick, you will go to the doctor in order to get the diagnosis, and you will not take a poll of people of what's wrong with me. And you won't do that because the common people are ignorant of it. You would go to the expert. And if Plato is the expert, you would go to him, not the common Greek person or the view that's common in there. This would be a reply to Lee. So again, what I'm showing you is how philosophy is done. We provide these arguments. There's a problem with Plato's argument against homosexuality, though. Plato's argument, you can evaluate it. His claim is that homosexuality is unnatural, therefore homosexuality is wrong. Unnatural, he says, because the animals don't do it. The problem with that is it has a false premise, which is the animals do it. The bees do it, the birds do it, even insects engage in it. And of course the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises, which is that there is no clear connection between what is natural and what is moral. So that you could consider someone like Siamese twins. That's unnatural. But we don't look at Siamese twins and go, what a bunch of vicious people. Right? Or people that have high intelligence, that's unnatural. People that can run really fast, much faster than others, that might be unnatural. But nonetheless, we don't think that that's immoral. So again, what we do is we go ahead and criticize these things. Now, let's get into ethical theories in animals. there are two main ethical theories that we're going to look at: consequentialism or utilitarianism, and deontology. Consequentialism, the example that we're going to use is utilitarianism, which is Jeremy Bentham, and the idea behind this is that they define what good is. Good equals pleasure. The justification for the claim that good equals pleasure is because that's how we are, which is that it is we are governed by two sovereign masters, pleasure and pain, and if you want to understand all of your actions, everything you do is movement towards pleasure or movement away from pain. And so that we define what the good is with utilitarianism, and from that I can judge what right and wrong action is. What Bentham says about animals is the question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? Because if the good is pleasure, and that what is wrong is that which is painful, we must take animals into consideration, because of course they are subject to pain and of pleasure. And so when we figure out what we're doing, we need to take the pain of the animals in the factory farms into consideration, and then the pleasure that you experience when you go ahead and eat at McDonald's. But please keep in mind, when we take into the pleasure that you have when you eat at McDonald's, we also include the displeasure you experience 15 minutes later after you eat at McDonald's. So animals, in this case, they count in our moral evaluations. The other one is from Immanuel Kant. This is deontology. For Kant, good equals adherence to the moral law. And that this moral law, it's judged by the categorical imperative. There's actually two forms to it, but one of them is act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. The idea is before you do anything, ask yourself, can you go ahead and universalize it so that everybody could do the same thing? And if you can, so that it doesn't lead to any sort of logical contradictions, then it's morally permissible. An example of something that's morally wrong might be lying or breaking promises, which is I go ahead and give you a promise, and then later on I decide to break it. Now the thing is, can we make it a universal law that everyone breaks their promises? And the problem is you cannot, because there's a logical contradiction in there. That the very idea of promise is going to be undermined by everybody being able to break their promise. Because a promise is that you are committed or that you're obligated to do something. If everyone can break it, nobody's obligated to do it. Therefore, there's no promise. So having a promise, you get no promise. This is the logical contradiction in Immanuel Kant, and this is why lying or breaking your promise is wrong. Now, with this, Immanuel Kant thinks that those with moral value are going to be the rational agents who we take into consideration when we universalize things. I take all of you into consideration when I universalize my moral law or my maxim, and the reason why is because you can all make choices too. You are all moral agents. I do not take into consideration Trudy, and the reason why I don't take into consideration Trudy the turkey, she's not a moral agent. And because she doesn't have any value, she's not a legislator in the kingdom of ends, she doesn't have any moral status. But what Immanuel Kant says is that to animals we owe no direct duties. I can't kill you, but I can kill the animals. But we have indirect duties to the animals. We ought not to treat animals cruelly, as it damages our natural sympathies and thus can harden us in our dealings with other humans. The question then, I thought of this earlier today, that perhaps we can't universalize the damaging of our natural sympathies, so cruelty to animals is morally wrong. That would be a question if you do Kantian ethics. I don't know how it would come out. But, so these are the main theories, and let's look at some applications to animals and some problems that go with it. Peter Singer is a famous philosopher for a lot of the outrageous things that he says. He's a utilitarian. He's a preference utilitarian. We're not going to have to get into the details here. But what he says is that since the type and intensity of utility or disutility, utility is the thing that goes into moral goodness, disutility takes away from moral goodness, is related to one's cognitive capacities, the moral status of animals is similar to humans of comparable mental capabilities. So that when you consider animals, you should also consider human beings that are mentally basically the same as animals. Because when we're doing our utilitarian calculations, they are on the same level. And so what he says is that human beings are guilty of speciesism. And the reason why is that there is a disparity between our treatment of how we treat animals and how we treat cognitively similar humans. So that a lot of cognitively similar humans might be special needs adults, most toddlers, and some elderly have the cognitive capacities of some animals. But because we do not treat them the same, we have this discrimination against animals, which is speciesism. And so speciesism is analogous to racism or sexism. And to avoid such speciesism, we ought to accord animals the same protection we do to comparable humans. That this would be the argument that we ought to treat animals a lot better. There are some problems with this argument, and it tells us what we might want in our argument for animal liberation. First off, the problem with Singer is that it's not necessarily an argument for the better treatment of animals, because it's also an argument for the ill treatment of marginal humans. Marginal humans are going to be those toddlers and some elderly, and then special needs adults. And that if we want to avoid speciesism, it's not that we need to treat animals better, but we need to treat these people a lot worse. And then we can go ahead and get out of it, right? So this is one of the things that follows from Singer's argument. The other thing is, Singer's argument is not an argument for animal rights. When you have a right, there's something inviolable, which is that I cannot go ahead and kill you because you have a right to life. But the thing is, with Singer, individuals' protection from pain is not a guarantee, because cruel treatment, the disutility, may be outweighed by greater utility. And so the thing is, if the pleasure that we experience from watching toddlers being used in circuses and animals being used in circuses outweighs the harm done to the toddler, then it's morally right for us to go ahead and do that to them. So this is another problem with it. And that it might be the case that discrimination is not wrong in itself, despite he treats speciesism as being wrong, because it's only wrong if it adds to greater disutility than utility. So perhaps the discrimination that we have in our treatment of animals is morally good, because if we didn't have that discrimination, then it would be, the disutility would be greater. So these are arguments that Singer has, and the problems with it. And the idea is that if we want an argument for the liberation of animals or the better treatment of animals, one of the things that we're not going to have is this utilitarianism. What we need is some value that we attribute to animals that cannot be outweighed by the utility of others. This is something that we would want, some guarantee for that treatment, which you're not going to get with Singer. And also with Singer, we can go ahead, we ought to treat our toddlers a lot worse than we do. We ought to do experiments on toddlers to avoid speciesism. Tom Regan is a deontologist, and what he's going to say is that there is something essential about the human being to which we attribute value to them. This is his subject of a life criterion. And what he says of this subject of life criterion is that these things are valuable that the subject of a life, to be a subject of a life, is to have beliefs, desires, perception, memory, and a sense of future, including their own future, an emotional life together with feelings of pleasure and pain, preference and welfare interests, the ability to initiate action in pursuit of desires and goals, a psychophysical identity over time, and an individual's welfare in the sense that their their life fares ill or well for them. And the idea is that we can go ahead and apply this to everyone. And the reason why is I find my life valuable because I have this subject of life criterion. And because my life is valuable because I go ahead and plan for the future, because I have interests, because how things go for me is a concern for me, the same thing is true for you. Since it's a value for me, I have to recognize that it's a value for you. And this is the respect principle. We're to treat those with inherent value in ways that respect their inherent value, because that's what I want for me. And that is, humans and animals who meet the criterion are of equal moral value. Now, the main problem with this subject of life criterion is that it's much too narrow, which is that autonomy and a sense of self seem to be packed into the criterion, that we can go ahead and choose to make this good life for us, that we have a sense of self through time. And the problem is that animals and some humans may not meet this criterion. And consequently, there's not a sufficient reason to attribute inherent value to some humans and animals. So the thing is, one problem with Regan is it's much too narrow, and we leave out a lot of humans and we leave out a lot of animals that we'd want to give some sort of value to. Regan recognizes this problem, that it's much too narrow, and he tries to fix it, but the problem is then he makes his argument much too broad. His response to solve this problem, he argues that the subject of life criterion is only sufficient for moral status, and that he claims it remains possible that animals that are conscious but not capable of acting intentionally, or say permanently comatose human beings, might nonetheless be viewed as having inherent value. He gives the subject of life. This is where we're going to give value to things, and so it's inviolable. We should not be doing things to them. The problem is it's much too narrow. It leaves a lot of people out, and it goes ahead and leaves most animals out. And so what he does is he goes ahead and says, well, there might be inherent value to unconscious humans and animals that are incapable of intentional action. The problem then is it's much too broad, which is if permanently unconscious humans have inherent value and rights, so too may all unconscious or non-conscious life. And that when you go ahead and start attributing value to these things, we're going to have to give inherent value to things like cancer cells, blades of grass, and viral meningitis, because these things are alive, and so they would have inherent value. And there's a huge problem with his attribution of moral status, which is it is zero sum. You either have it or you don't. And if we're going to go ahead and give inherent value to all life, then we need to treat all life or respect all life in the way that we would respect ourselves. And so the problem is complicated in that cancer cells have as much inherent value as the person who is eaten away by them. And this does not seem correct. So the argument is either too broad or it's too narrow. And if we want an argument for animal liberation, this is what we're going to need. We need a theory of attributing moral value to animals. And it must apply to animals and marginal humans as equally as applied to adult humans. Not be easily outweighed by the utility of others, and clearly apply to animals, but not plants, cancer cells, or bacterium. And to develop this argument, this is going to be my argument, which goes ahead and fits these things. To develop this argument, I'm going to look at R.G. Frey. R.G. Frey is going to go ahead and argue against animal rights. He is opposed to animal rights. And that we're going to go ahead and take a look at his argument. And from his argument, I actually develop mine. R.G. Frey has the unequal value thesis, which is that animal life is less valuable than human life. The defense is that it's an appeal to your intuitions, that all things considered, the killing of a human seems morally worse than the killing of a dog. The saving a human is morally better than the saving of the dog. Of course, it might depend upon whose dog it is and which human it is, and what that human is like and what the dog is like, right? If it's a talking dog, it might be. And that what is the source of this difference between animals and humans? He says that it's autonomy. And this autonomy is basically our ability to mold our lives to fit a conception of the good life. We can try to live out this conception with all the sense of achievement, self-fulfillment, and satisfaction this can bring. This is what animals don't do, which is that they don't have an idea of a good life and then deliberate about how best to achieve their good life. And this source of autonomy, it has an instrument of value because it leads to the good life. Animals don't have it, so this is where we get the difference in value between animals and human beings. His justification that autonomy is so important and so valuable to us is reflection. He says that when we look back on our lives and regret that we did not make more of them, we rarely have in mind only the kind of activities we share with animals. Rather, we think much more in terms of precisely these other dimensions of our lives that equally go to make up a rich, full life. Which is that when you reflect on your life, like when you're on your deathbed and you're regretting things, I wish I would have done things differently. You're not going to be like, man, I wish I ate more food, or I wish I would have got petted more, or I wish I would have had sex more. That you're not going to be reflecting on these. I doubt that, right? That you're going to be like, man, well, some forms of sex. You might wish that you had some forms of sex more. So, this is Frey's argument. humans have a greater moral status than animals. The reason why humans have a greater moral status than animals is because they are able to develop their own good life with this autonomy. How do we know that autonomy is valuable? We reflect on it. When we think back on our lives and wish we would have made more of it, it's going to be the stuff that involves our autonomy, which is that which separates us from the animals. Consequently, humans have a greater moral status than animals. We might not be able to do anything we want to animals, but nonetheless, humans are still have a greater moral status. So from Frey's argument, I'm going to develop mine. Now, according to Frey, autonomy is valuable since on reflection we wish we'd have exercised it more. But when you're on your deathbed or you're reflecting upon which you would have done more, probably on your deathbed is the best way to do this, that when you reflect on your deathbed, what you're going to find is that what you wish you may have done would be to reach out to others or share emotionally reciprocal connections, which is to have a mutuality in our experiences. And of course, you know when you have this mutuality and you don't, when you go ahead and you look at a person and there's a connection, which is that we share and we're in this moment together, and that there really isn't much else to this world but what we have right now. That this is the kind of things that we might wish for. So that we're going to wish for these emotionally reciprocal connections seem to be of greater value, or what we'll reflect upon, which we wish we would have done more, than more success at work. That love shared with our lifelong companions, expressing love to a parent, being open to love of others, such moments seem more likely to occupy our deathbed reflections than our failure to become a more knowledgeable amateur astronomer, which would have been the exercise of our autonomy. So it is these things that are valuable. It is these things on reflection that we value. And what I'm going to call these experiences is going to be meaningfulness. One, because of their central value that we have in our lives, and also the kind of weight that we recognize that they have. So these moments in our lives that have emotional depth and weight, closeness between parent and child, husband and wife, God and devotee, friends, and in these experiences there is safety, trust, mutuality, and honesty, and we ourselves, and we're loved, and we experience the joy of giving ourselves freely. These are the kind of things that we value. Martin Buber calls this an I-thou relationship. What he says of this is, when you're in this I-thou relationship, if I face a human being as my thou and say the primary word I thou to him, he is not a thing among things and does not consist of things. Thus human being is not he or she, bounded from every other he or she. But with no neighbor and whole in himself, he is thou and fills the heavens. This does not mean that nothing exists except himself, but all else is in his light. And it is these experiences to which we really give value. And it's these kind of things which I would like to call meaningful. So, we have these meaningful experiences. They're going to be valuable because we reflect on them on our deathbed and wish we would have been able to open ourselves up to people, but because we were not, that we're miserable on our deathbed. Oh yeah, that's just the argument I just gave. The interesting thing is, I think animals experience these things. Martin Buber, I don't think I brought it with me, but Martin Buber goes ahead and tells this story of when he was young, he would sneak away and go ahead and pet this horse. And the thing is, he would feel the immensity of this thou, which is that he would feel the mutuality he experiences with this horse when he goes ahead and he loves it. And then one time he says that he went to go ahead and pet this horse, and what he did was he focused on himself, which is the pleasure that he gained from petting the horse. And then from then on, the relationship with the horse changed, which is that there was not this openness, there was not this mutuality, but rather he feels that he had been judged, and so something is lost in it, which is that there was the I-thou relationship. And you experience this too with your animals, with your pets, that when they go ahead and lay on your chest and you pet them, and that you do feel a deep connection between them, and that these are meaningful moments. And it's true that you have other things that go into your good life, but it might be the case because animals are limited in what they can do. They don't have the same cognitive capacities as us, that their experience of these moments are much greater than our experiences. So their experience of meaningful moments, of connections with us, might be much greater. So this is one of the things, is that we do experience these moments, and our pets experience these moments too. And these, of course, are what we hold to be most valuable. animals also experience among each other. So one of the things is that you know that there is a deep connection by way of familiarity in monogamy. And the thing is, the value of such familiarity and intimacy of these couples provides meaning to their lives. But many animals mate for life, and the chemicals that underlie human bonding also underlie animal bonding. And so that deep connection that you feel with your long-term partner, animals will feel this too. You consider that valuable, you consider that meaningful, and you attribute value to it. Since animals have it, they have a comparable value. And not only this, oh yeah, and such behavioral and chemical similarity suggests that they're experiencing this also. One of the things is that a deep form of connection that we have is when we're a child, and that mother-child connection. And that you might remember this, that being a child, you'll find that it's comforting, caring, and kind. Human mothers, inspired by love, hold their babies and sing. One of the things that we know, I got this from this book, Bat Sing, Mice Giggle, which is about the inner lives of animals, is that bat mothers do this also, which is that they cradle their babies and they also make up songs too. So they seem to do the same thing. And if we recognize that the making up of these songs as a sign of the deep connection between the mother and the child, so too is there a deep connection between the mother and the child bat. So that animals are experiencing this also. Oops. How do I go back? Okay. So the conclusion I'd like to draw is that meaningful experiences are valuable since meaningful life is part of the good life. It is essential to our good life that we have these connections. Animals appear to have meaningful experiences. Consequently, the moral status due to animals is partly determined by the moral weight we would assign to creatures to whom meaning is part of their lives. And protection of this value must be consistent with the value we assign to meaningful experiences. And as I said, that this is essential to your good life, and on your deathbed reflection, you're going to wish you would have done it more, you attribute a high value to it. And because animals have it, they also have a high moral status. Now, the benefits of this argument against Singer and Regan is that it applies to animals and marginal humans. Some people don't like that term. Marginal humans are just going to be like children. They're marginal humans, special needs adults, and some elderly. But it applies to animals and marginal humans as equally as applied to adult humans. As argued, meaningful experiences are open to animals as they are to adult humans, and special needs adults may be especially open to some of these deep connections, which is that they are very open to being close to others. They're very open to these I-thou connections. And so the meaningful experiences that we value may be often experienced by special needs adults as well as animals. So this is one of the things is that it applies to whom we want it to. The other thing with Singer, remember, that with Singer there was no guarantee that an individual's interest would be taken into consideration because it could be outweighed by the utility of others. But that's not true when it comes to these meaningful experiences because they're not reducible to utilitarian calculations. They are inherent, they are non-instrumental value elements of a good life. And might I even say that they might be the most valuable parts of our good life. The problem that we saw with Regan is that it became much too narrow, which is that if you want to attribute inherent value to all life, the problem is that cancer cells, plants, viral meningitis have inherent value as humans have inherent value. But this isn't going to apply to the argument that I just gave, if we want to go ahead and apply value by meaningful experiences. Because given lack of experience, no other life other than animal life are potentially experiencers of meaning. Consequently, I don't have to worry about a valuable life or a meaningful life for viral meningitis, so we can try and get that out of you, or for bacteria, or for cancer cells. Right, that's what philosophy does, right? I told you what other people thought, I told you why that was wrong, and I come with a similar conclusion, but one that avoids the pitfalls of these other theories. There are several criticisms to my view. I'll just go through a couple of them real fast. When are we done at where it's when the big hand's on 10? Okay. I might not do all of these. Other minds with different brains. Say that we go ahead and we figure out that meaningful experience, we can figure out the sort of isolate the substrate where human beings experience meaningfulness in their lives. So we go ahead and take a human being, hook them up to an fMRI machine, and then we go ahead and tell what their brain is doing when they think or we put the baby in the fMRI machine with the mom. And then we can go ahead and see what's going on in their brain. What if the animal brain is not like the human brain? Then we might want to say that their experiences might not be like our experiences. The reply to this is that there might be multiple realizability of experiences. So just because the brain is different, it still might be the case that their experiences are the same. And the reason why I think animal experiences are like ours is mostly by way of their behavior. But this brings me to the second criticism, which is the meaningful life of robots. I do not attribute mental states to robots. Not right now. At some time there might be, but certainly how we do things now, that they're not going to have mental states. But the thing is, you've seen these robots from Japan, and that they are very emotional, and that you might feel an emotional connection with them. It's probably going to be a few more years where you people are going to be able to get robot girlfriends and boyfriends, and that there are going to be times when you look deeply into the eyes of the robot and feel the mutuality, feel the connection, but nonetheless, that robot is not there with you. So it might be the case that just because animals have the behavior, as the robot might have the behavior, it doesn't follow that the robot has the experience, so too the animal might not have the experience. From the behavior, I cannot go to the mental state. The difference between animals and robots is that animals are basically just like us. They're made of the same stuff. Robots aren't. They're hardware and software, and that there's a disanalogy between the software being my brain, or the program being my mind, and the software being my brain, that there's a disanalogy. I think animals experience like me because animals show behavior that is like me, and animals are basically made up of the same stuff that I am. And this is the reason why I would think that robots, at this time, don't have meaningful lives, but animals do. Genesis 1:28, you got dominion over the animals, right? And so this might be an argument that you might have. The problem with this is that in Genesis, I believe it is on the second day, God goes ahead and puts plants on the land. On the morning of the fourth day, God goes ahead and puts life in the sea. This is backwards, that life begins in the sea, it doesn't begin on land. And that if you go ahead and read that first page and it gets that wrong, you can go ahead and close that book. The sadistic reply, this would be somebody who says, oh yeah, it's the meaningfulness of their lives that makes animals delicious. This cannot, first off, it's true that animals that would have happier lives are going to taste better than animals that don't have happier lives. This is the reason why that one kind of beef is so expensive. What is it? Kobe beef. That's the reason why it's so expensive, because these animals have had meaningful lives. That is a tongue-in-cheek response, and the thing is, the value that you attribute to meaningfulness, you also have to attribute it to the animals, and that if you are not consistent, if you are not rational, I might not consider you to be a person. So the more that you would take that reply seriously, the less you're a person. And that's fine. If you don't want to be a person, that's fine. Solitary animals, this is another thing, which is non-social animals. And so it might be the case that they do not experience meaningfulness in their lives. The reply is, they nonetheless do. There's an example of a guy who's up in the Arctic. He goes ahead and he sees a polar bear. You can see this on YouTube. And the polar bear hasn't eaten, he can tell, because it's emaciated. And his dog runs off to go meet the polar bear. And he's like, well, that's going to be the end of my dog. The thing is that the dog gets up to the polar bear and it does the play stance. And the thing is, the dog and the polar bear engage in play. And then that is a close connection that we have. The polar bear is a solitary animal. And that polar bear showed up for like 3 extra nights to do nothing but play with that dog. And so these solitary animals might also have these mutuality, these meaningful experiences. Non-reflective, you reflect that these moments are valuable, and so you attribute value to them. Animals probably don't reflect on their experiences because they don't have the cognitive capacities, and so do not recognize the value of them. The reply to this is, it doesn't really matter. If you never thought about your meaningful experiences, they would still be meaningful. And so there is still meaning to animals' lives despite the fact that they don't have the same cognitive capacities that we do. Evolution deflation. This is just that the experience of meaning is nothing but is the result of natural selection. And I don't care from where it comes from. This thing still feels very valuable, and so I'm going to attribute value to it. And I don't care if it is from evolution. That makes no difference to me. And I don't even believe in that nonsense. The arguments don't work, and your evidence doesn't work. Animals don't take us into consideration. Again, animals might be moral patients, which is that we ought to treat them a certain way, but they're not moral agents. They're not going to deliberate about what they should do and what they should not do. They might, I don't know, but we'll say that they're just moral patients. But as moral patients, we owe them certain duties. We owe them certain treatment. And how are we going to determine that treatment? By what value we attach to the animals. And what value are we going to attach? That of a creature that experiences meaningfulness in their lives. That's the value that we attach. So it's true they don't take us into consideration, but they still have a moral value that we ought to respect. Anyway, that's it. You can clap because you're glad it's over. Any questions?
Yes. So we leave out people who are in a coma or people with severe autism who don't have meaningful moments of connection with others? Psychopaths?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things is the meaningfulness, it may be, you could think of a potential meaningfulness. You could also think of meaningful moments that they have experienced. You can think about the value that is attributed to them by the connection that they do have with people that aren't in the coma. But it might be in some cases that that if they don't have any sort of possibility of meaningful experiences, then they don't have such value. The thing is that this is not an argument that it's necessary to have meaningful experiences to be valuable. All I'm saying that is meaningful experiences or potential for meaningful experiences is sufficient to be valuable. There might be other things that we would attribute value to them, whereby we shouldn't do things to permanently comatose people, right?
If we're going to attribute other things, then eating a pizza is value, right?
Eating a pizza is valuable.
It's a meaningful moment.
Yeah, it is a pleasurable experience. It does have some value, which is that it's better that your pizza not have anchovies than have anchovies, right? Yeah, so do that. So, but nonetheless, my argument, it provides a sufficient condition to attribute moral status or moral value to animals. It is not a necessary connection, so even things that lack it, there might be something else that, that garners moral consideration for them.
Based on your reply to the first criticism,
Yeah.
I feel like you would have to give a meaningful life to robots.
Okay.
Multiple realizability.
Yeah.
Even though their hardware and software is different, they still still complete the same function as other minds.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one of the things is that you know that with functionalism, we're not going to get any sort of qualia. Qualia is what it's like to experience stuff, right? And that with the functionalism, you can go ahead and explain how this system works, but nonetheless, the qualia isn't going to be there. The argument against the claim that functionalism works, and that it leaves out the qualia is the inverted spectrum. And I'm not going to get into that, but you know the argument. Anybody else? Yeah.
So are you saying, are you trying to say that like animals and humans are like completely 100% different? Or are you trying to say that they're more like us than we think they are?
I'm saying that their moral status, the moral value in their lives is more like us than we now attribute. Because one of the things that we do not consider is that what is valuable to us are meaningful experiences. And animals have meaningful experiences so that they're more like us in that way. And that's the reason why you attribute these moral values to them.
The quality of the meaningful experiences is the same for all animals. You know, your argument about solitary animals is kind of weak, talking about a polar bear as opposed to an ant or a fish. Or
yeah, I mean there are going to be some things that don't have experiences, right? I mean I think that there is something it is like to be my cat. right? I don't know if there is something it is like to be an ant. And so that it's okay to go ahead and step on the ants, unless there is another reason to go ahead and attribute some sort of moral value to them. I don't think that there is, that you can go ahead and kill all the ants you want, except, of course, if it hardens your heart. Then you probably should not, right? So don't tear the things off, but when they're in your bedroom, go ahead and step on them. Yeah? Steve?
I'm just curious, how many people on their deathbeds did you interview?
Oh, yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Yeah. I mean, again, what this is it is going to be, it's partly based upon what I think people would reflect upon. And that the more your intuitions are like mine, the stronger the argument is. Do I have to go ahead and interview death on their deathbed? Well, I could. What I could also do is, I think that on the deathbed, people are going to be a little bit more serious about it. Because if I ask you right now, what do you wish you would have done more? Then you might say, make more money, have more sex, eat more pizza. And I think that there really are other experiences that we value. And that when we reflect on these things, we will see that there is this connection. And we will regret, like, maybe not on their deathbed, but when your parents die, people often think, oh, I wish I would have said that I love them, or I wish I would have reached out to them more, right? And what this is, it's an example of what was valuable in that relationship and what we would have done. And so with that, I take it and kind of reverse it to that on our deathbed, we would reflect and wish that we would have been open more. Perhaps the father is like that, which is, I wish I would have reached out to my child more.
But some people may think, I'm glad they died because I inherited a lot of money.
That's true. That's true.
I mean, when I'm on my deathbed, I might wish I had chosen another career.
Yes.
I might wish I would have killed someone I hated.
That's right.
I might wish I would have divorced my shrew of a wife.
Yes. You know what you need to do, Steve? You need to make a list of things that you wish you would have done on your deathbed, and you need to kill that person. You need to divorce that shrew, and you need to do whatever the first one was. It probably had something to do with sex. Really perverted sex with a stripper in Las Vegas.
But his point is,
Yeah.
his point is valid, that this is your intuition
Yes.
about what people
Yes.
say or want on their deathbed,
Yeah.
and that's no more valid than mine. Mine might be different.
Right.
And one last comment, and then I'll shut up. But on
Let me
YouTube-
write this down.
On YouTube, are there any videos of polar bears who actually killed the dog and ate the dog? If there are more polar bears that kill the dog,
Oh, yeah. Here's the thing.
one example that you cite.
That is not the only reason. The reply wasn't that polar bears and dogs have meaningful experience. It was a reply to the problem of the solitary animals, which is that the polar bear is a solitary animal, but it can still have these meaningful experiences. It had it with this dog. Might it go ahead and eat the dog sometime? It might. But nonetheless, the possibility of a meaningful experience or the capacity for it is still in the polar bear. So even if it would have eaten the dog, it may still have these experiences with some other animal, or there may be other things that would have these meaningful experiences.
An aberrant polar bear.
Yeah, it might have been, but it had a meaningful experience with this dog as far as play goes. But you're right. I mean, I am appealing to these intuitions. If you don't follow me with these intuitions, then perhaps we should just leave you behind.
The only reason why you can make that point is you're a valid source. Like you have.
Because I have cancer. And then I reflect on it, and I do wish I would have loved my dad more.
Well, you have a PhD in ethics, so therefore you are an acceptable resource to go toward them.
I'm an acceptable resource when it comes to telling you what ethical theories are. I might not be an acceptable resource when it comes to, I certainly am not when it comes to meaningful experiences. I am an acceptable resource in regretting that I didn't engage in more meaningful experiences. But Mike Hartman.
Yes, Dr. Backen. You said that you theorize, or your proposition is that animals are made of the same stuff that you are,
Yeah.
or that we are?
Yeah, I've checked. That's empirical, and I've checked.
Did you mean to suggest that animals are made of, shame, fear, and self-loathing?
Well, one of the things is that animals do not have the capacity for some emotions, right? Because they don't have the cognitive capacities for, like, a sense of self. And so they're not going to experience shame. They can experience meaningfulness, I'm arguing, but they're not going to experience shame.
Why not?
That in order for you to experience shame, you have to have a sense that you did something wrong. Okay. This is an example. I like this. That if you actually put in dog, shame, you get a lot of things that are pretty funny. Maybe it is the case that animals experience shame, because it would go with my other argument that I'm judging what's going on inside of them by way of their behavior. And so what you would have to do is observe more animals on YouTube. Which is mainly my resource. And what I will do, Stephen, if it'll make you happy, I will YouTube deathbed regrets and see what kind of stuff I get.
I assume your dismissal of evolution was flippant.
Huh?
I assume your dismissal of evolution was flippant.
No, it's a circular argument.
Yeah, yours or the evolution argument?
The evolutionary argument.
Well, I don't think so, because as a wise psychologist pointed out, meaning is the experience of emotion or pleasure. Okay, that's what gives any experience meaning. Without it, there is no meaning.
Okay.
Okay, and emotions are an evolutionary adaptation.
Yes.
Look at other species, the complexity and variety of their emotions is very different.
Yeah.
So we have no reason to believe that ants have emotions. We have lots of reasons to believe that dogs have emotions.
Yeah.
Polar bears have
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you're right. I am sort of tongue-in-cheek. I do have an argument that you should reject evolutionary theory, but I do believe that these are traits that come from natural selection. If you really want to pressure me on it, I will say that there is such a thing as evolution.
So if meaning comes from evolution, so does homicide and jealousy and rape.
Yeah, these things too, but it wouldn't. Homicide, jealousy, and rape wouldn't be the things that we would reflect upon as being valuable in our lives, except for some people might reflect on their deathbed. I wish I would have committed more homicide, right?
This program has to appreciate.
Yeah, but the thing is, here's the thing. There might be some people that are not attuned to what is valuable in life. This might be because they were raised crummy or they got some sort of defect, and so they cannot recognize what is valuable. That the person that wishes they would have done more rape, done more homicide on their deathbed, I believe that they are not attuned towards the moral reality that is available to us.
So your argument comes down to the fact that evolution has shaped us to value human connection more than.
Actually, what I think is that what evolution has done, it has given us a capacity to feel the moral reality that is out there in the world. And one of the ways that we experience the moral reality is by way of these emotions. That there is a moral reality, that by way of evolution we have come to experience that moral reality, as by way of evolution we have eyes to experience the world visually. So too, by way of our emotions, we can experience what is really valuable, and that this kind of stuff is really valuable. And if you don't think that it is, then you're not attuned to the moral reality that's there. Anyway, thanks.
Adams State College. Great stories begin here.